Hello, everybody, and welcome to PACO Module 7. In this module, we are going to be talking about disaster response. And for the most part, what we're going to be talking about is disaster response in those first 72 hours after a disaster. My name is Donia Conn, and I am an assistant professor at Simmons University for the School of Library and Information Science, and Simmons is in Boston, Massachusetts. But I am also an instructor and consultant who does a lot of work in disaster planning, response, and recovery. So I am thrilled to be joining you for this program. And I just also want to let you all know and remind you that PACO is brought to you by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we want to make sure to thank them very much. So when we think about emergency response, of course, we're thinking about it in relationship to the Comprehensive Emergency Management Program that we learned about back at the very beginning in Module 1. So we've already covered mitigation, prevention, and preparedness. And so now it's time to take a look at response, and we're going to give a bit of a nod to recovery in this as well. So we just want to be thinking now that we're almost to the end of this list, but always remember that it's not just a single linear process. We're going to be always doing risk assessments when something changes. We're going to be continuing to plan as we learn more and we have more time to keep adding to our plan. And we're always going to be taking those steps to really be prepared. But today, of course, we're going to focus on response. And in your first webinar, CJ talked about this great little table that she put together for us. And it talks about the risk assessment and the risk management that we did for prevention, talks about preparedness, and now we are on to response, which is during the disaster. And I am going to add another layer of that. And I want us to be thinking about there are actually two parts to response. There's your immediate response. And so this is your immediate reaction to an emergency as it's occurring. So that could be your fire alarms are going off and you're evacuating your building. You're not going to take a lot of time to think about this. The fire alarms go off, you evacuate the building. Because as CJ talked about, as we're going to talk about a lot in this webinar, personal safety is paramount. So when those fire alarms go off, you get out of the building until you know why they're going off. It's reacting to the event. So it could be your reaction to turning the water off so that that overflowing toilet isn't overflowing anymore. That's your immediate response. And it could be sheltering in place for potentially a major weather event, or depending on the major weather event, it's evacuating because you've been told to evacuate. So for all of these, we're going to be thinking our personal safety is first. And also for a lot of these, these immediate responses should be ingrained in you. You shouldn't need to know, oh, I need to go look in my disaster plan to find out what I need to do when the fire alarm is going off. Or I need to look up what I need to do when the toilet is overflowing. Now, for there, you could look up where's the shutoff valve, because the shutoff valve in the toilet won't shut off. And that's common because they get all gummed up. So you would need to look and see where your shutoff valve for the water to the building is. And that's okay. But for a lot of this immediate response, it should really be ingrained in you. And we're going to talk about how we can make sure that we know immediately what to do for some of these. If we don't, that's where your pocket response plan is going to be incredibly helpful, because it's just a short, immediate use document. And those quick response guides that you've been making, those flip books, are going to be immensely helpful. Once we've taken care of that immediate response, we've gotten out of the building, we've made sure everybody else is safely out of the building, we know what's going on. We've gotten the water shut off to that overflowing toilet. We've, made it through whatever weather event we had to shelter in place for was. Or we've evacuated and we can now return to our building. Then we start to transition. And here it's going to be the response that we do leading into recovery. And so we have this transitional response where we're going to be doing a damage assessment and we're going to start moving in to planning for triage and salvage. Triage and salvage itself is going to be part of recovery, but we're going to talk a little bit about moving into triage and salvage at the end of this webinar. But for the most part, we're going to be looking at what we're going to be doing after our immediate response, but before we start our disaster recovery activities themselves. So we want to think about disaster response and recovery as a little circular or triangular piece within that pentagon that we were looking at for the emergency management system. And in our response and recovery, we're going to be doing this constant cycle of reviewing, assessing, and planning, because you could do an review and assessment at the beginning and make a really great plan. But as we know, something's going to go wrong. Something's not going to be as we expected, and we need to adjust that plan. So we need to review the information. We need to assess the information. We need to adjust the plan. So this is a constant and ongoing process, but we're going to talk about it so that we understand what we need to do. So again, we were talking about our immediate response and our short-term, that short-term recovery. So one of your immediate responses could be, there's an earthquake. So what do you do in the event of an earthquake? Okay, so your immediate response is to ensure human health and safety. And then when that earthquake is over, you come back to your building, and here we have a picture of the Chugiak Eagle River Library after the earthquake in 2018, and we can see just books have fallen off of shelves. Not unusual for an earthquake. So then once we can get back into the building and it's safe, we can move into that transitional response leading to our recovery. Before we really get into the response nitty-gritty of this webinar, I just want to reiterate some very important strategic priorities. So when you're planning, when you're doing your mitigation, it's really easy to go, oh yeah, things are okay. We're going to remember that, personal safety is important. But sometimes when you are presented with the sight of your institution being damaged or devastated almost by a disaster, you're going to feel a lot of emotion. And so sometimes you don't think clearly. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's okay to stop and take time for a cry. If you need to take 10, 15 minutes and just let your emotions out, because it's healthy to do so, and it's going to release a lot of stress to allow you to think more clearly. And the reason you need to think more clearly is because one of the things people tend to forget, but that is the most important thing in a disaster response, as well as during disaster recovery, is personal safety is paramount. You will not do anything until you can ensure that you are personally safe. And then, as CJ said in her webinar, which is very important, then you are going to ensure that all of your colleagues are also making sure that their personal safety is paramount, but you're always going to think about yourself first and then take care of others. We're going to then focus on ensuring that our building is stable. Is it stable enough to go in? Has the, have gas and electricity and whatnot been turned off? We need to make sure that we have somebody knowledgeable who can tell us, yes, it's safe to enter your building. Because how do we know if our building has shifted on its foundation? How do we know if our building has severe cracks that may affect the structural integrity of our building? Until we have somebody that knows how to look for that, knows how to assess that, we shouldn't be going into our building. So in the image on the slide here, we see the city of Kodiak after the tsunami that came after the earthquake in 1964. And, although we know that none of these are necessarily collection holding buildings, they're not museums, but with buildings like this, after a tsunami, has it shifted on its foundation? Water is incredibly strong. Was there any damage because of the earthquake? Do we have damage because one of those fishing boats ran into our building during the tsunami? So we want to be thinking about that structural integrity. And of course, our personal safety in something like this is going to mean making sure we've got the proper footwear, making sure we've got proper, protection for our hands, for our eyes, for our bodies, for our heads. And we're always going to be making sure of where we put our feet. Because, in a disaster like this, there are going to be a lot of slipping and tripping hazards. So again, personal safety, and then making sure your property is stable. And then and only then are we going to focus on salvage of our collections. So if you take nothing else from this webinar, please, again, remember these strategic priorities. Number 1 is safety, number 2 is stabilization, and number 3 is salvage. I know we've seen most recently, I think of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, when it had its fire, we saw people bravely carrying out works of art from the cathedral. And what you need to understand is those were the Paris firefighters doing that work. They had a team who had already ensured that all of the people involved with the cathedral were safe. They had a team who was fighting the fire, and then they had enough of a team that team could carry out the collections. And what you need to understand is that the cathedral and the Paris Fire Department had a long-standing relationship, so that the fire department understood what were the most important items in the cathedral that, should a fire happen, would need to be carried out. And because they had that relationship, and because the fire department had the people power to break out into these teams, they could carry out all of those important artistic works. So doing something like that in the middle of a fire is not your job. It is not safe for you to do so. So don't do it. Heroics aren't going to mean anything if you're dead. So thinking back when I mentioned that there was kind of this triangle of activities that you're going to be constantly doing in response and recovery. Review is the first of those steps. So you want to be reviewing what sort of disaster is it? Where is my disaster plan? Do I have it on hand? What sort of protective equipment are we going to need for staff? There's going to be a lot of questions going on in your mind. And so this is why we want to stop and review. And in many ways, depending on the type of disaster you've had and the size of that disaster, you can review any number of the elements of your plan that you've got. For some, it's going to just be that pocket response plan. The toilet is overflowed. We've turned the toilet off. Who do we call? Who's our plumber? Your plumber is probably on your pocket response plan as one of your important contacts. If it's something slightly larger, or, for that we would use our quick guide for, so the toilet was overflowing, but the valve on the toilet didn't turn, so we couldn't turn the water off at the toilet. Where is the shut-off valve for the building so that we can shut the water off? That you would probably need your flip guide, which would be an important, which would have important information like that. And then once the water is turned off and you've called your plumber, then you can go to your larger plan, look at your floor plans, see if there was anything below that bathroom that would be a collection storage area that could be damaged, or it could be that the water has seeped through the wooden floor and has stained the plaster ceiling in the room below. So you're going to need to call other people for the longer term recovery. But in that immediate response, that pocket response plan and the quick guide are going to be your friends. In the recovery is when you're going to go to your binder, because that immediate response needs quick and easy access to the information. And that's where your quick guide and pocket response plan come in. And that's why we're having you do them. So that first step in response is always going to be reviewing your plan, reviewing the people you need, reviewing the personal protective equipment you need. And you've had a lot of really great training on this, so I'm just going to reiterate. I like to always make sure that you have an up-to-date tetanus shot. For those of you working in museums, that's an important thing to have anyway, because heaven only knows what you're going to cut yourself, impale yourself, scratch yourself with in your collections while you're processing. But it becomes very important when you're doing disaster response. I always have my tetanus shot updated only because I know I'm a klutz. And if there's something to scratch yourself on, I will be the one to do it. You're going to want to have different kinds of gloves on hand. You're going to want to have leather for heavy cleanup. And then you want to have nitrile or latex for handling the collections when we get to the salvage aspect. I tend to prefer nitrile because latex often causes people allergic reactions. So I tend to just have one type of glove on hand, and I make sure that that glove is nitrile. One thing to make sure is, as you're putting together these kits for your disaster supplies, always check the expiration date, because your nitrile gloves and your latex gloves, if that's what you choose to use, as well as your masks, have expiration dates, and that's because the plastic in them does break down over time. So you don't want to have a disaster situation and go to put on your nitrile gloves and have the fingers tear out, or go to put on your N95 or N100 mask and have the elastic just stretch out and not respond back again. So be sure when you are doing your annual review of your disaster plan that you do that annual review of your disaster kits, and that you check the expiration dates along with checking anything that may have batteries in it. You're also going to want to have goggles, because you never know where debris is going to come at you in a disaster situation. So regular glasses don't count. You need goggles that are going to protect your eyes from above, from below, and from the sides. I also forgot to put it on the slide, but you also want hard hats, because again, things coming at you from all directions, you don't want something to bonk you on the head. And then protective clothing. And depending on what stage you are in the response, this could be different things. When you're doing that immediate response, that transitional response, you're going in, you're checking things out, you're climbing over debris. Tyvek coveralls are actually really handy, because it's going to mean you don't have to bring a change of clothes with you to the disaster site. You can put the Tyvek coverall on, you can go through your sooty, mucky, wet building, and the Tyvek coveralls are going to take all that dirt and soot and whatnot, and you just take the Tyvek coverall off at the end, and your clothes are still clean, and you can get in your car, and you're not bringing anything home with you. When we get to salvage, triage and salvage, we can pretty much go down to aprons, but sometimes Tyvek coveralls are needed as well, depending on what sort of job you're doing. But we will be getting to that. You may need to review what vendors you're going to need. This could be plumbers and carpenters and people of that ilk, but it could also mean knowing what you know has happened in the disaster. Even if you haven't gotten into your building yet, you're probably going to need to be calling your insurance agent. You're going to be needing to think about whether you're going to need a professional conservator for specialty items that need immediate care or much more complex care than you can offer during triage and salvage. And a lot of times it really helps to have those relationships built with people who can help. It could be, of course, making sure that you are thinking about calling in the elders of the communities that you hold materials in trust for. There may be sacred objects in there that need special handling in the event of triage and salvage, and you want to make sure that you are respecting those cultures even during your disaster response. So it's all going to depend on what you have and who you need to contact. And so this is where reviewing your disaster plan, reviewing that list of priority collections, and reviewing all of those contacts is going to help remind you who you need to contact to help you with the disaster response. And that could even be disaster recovery vendors. ServPro, ServiceMaster are fine if they are just drying out your building. But in the ideal world, to help, if it's a major disaster and you can't handle it in-house yourself, you do need to call in help from professionals who know how to work with cultural heritage collections. And there really are only 3 of those in the country. There's Polygon, who we see here in this image on the right. This is freeze drying chambers, which helps to dry materials more quickly, but also with a lot less distortion. There's also BMS Cat and Belfour, and I believe all of the contact for all of these are in the module for module 7. And then on the left, we see a conservator working on a painting. And so this is one of the National Heritage Responders volunteers who was working in Haiti after the earthquake and helping to stabilize damaged materials there. And we'll get to who the National Heritage Responders are later on in this webinar. That during that review period, it's also really important, as I was saying, to be building on those relationships you already have. One of the resources in module 7, or maybe not module 7, I know it's in one of the modules, is working with emergency responders. So make sure that you take time to read that document and really build those relationships with your emergency responders, but then take that same concept and start using it to build relationships with the vendors that you may need. So building that relationship with your plumber, so he's more willing to come in the middle of the night if that's what it takes. Building those relationships with the conservators, and so on. So now we get really to the meaty part of this webinar, which is assessment. So we can't plan if we don't have information. So what we want to do is to gather an assessment team. And this is going to be for an initial damage assessment. We only need 3 to 4 people. And ideally, this team of people is going to include your facilities person. So somebody who really knows your building and its issues in the past, how it's constructed, all of its little nuances and quirks. This person is probably the one that's going to be your logistics person or your health and safety officer, or probably both, depending on the size of your institution. You're going to have somebody who knows the collections. So this could be your curator. It could, could be the archivist. It could be one of the librarians. It depends on your institution. This is going to be the person who would probably be your operations specialist, but again, it depends on how you've got your incident command, your ICS team structured in the command structure. You might want your incident commander as part of this team, but that's not required. But it can help for the incident commander to really be a part of gathering the information needed so they have that boots on the ground look at what's going on. And then in an ideal world, you will have a separate person who is just going to be the photographer. And ideally, this would be your information officer, because they're the ones that are going to have to be talking to the media and talking to other people about what's going on. So part of what this team is going to be doing is they're going to be going in and gathering information. So in the image here, we essentially see a team from FEMA doing just that. They're gathering information. So what is this damage assessment that this team is going to be going in and doing? It's going to be a very short information gathering session. You're going to go into the building for maybe 15 to 20 minutes, at most a half an hour, because it's just information gathering. You're not going to be picking anything up. You're not going to be moving anything. You're not going to be starting to salvage anything. You're just going in and looking. So it doesn't take that much time. You're going to be taking notes and taking photographs on the type of the damage that's occurred and what's caused the damage, where damaged collections are located, and then how much of the collection is damaged. All of this information is necessary for being able to create an incident action plan. How are you going to be looking for this information? You're going to be taking lots of photographs. You're going to be taking lots of notes. Probably what's going to happen is your facility specialist is going to be taking lots of notes on what the building needs, because that's their specialty. You'll have somebody taking notes on all of the health and safety considerations. That could be your incident commander. And then you're going to be taking lots of notes on just what the collections need. And that's why you've got your collection specialist. So we're going to be assessing all of this so that we can plan. And so, don't forget to look attic to basement if it's safe for you to get there, but also do part of your damage assessment outside. So in the image here, we see a gentleman looking underneath a building that's been jacked up after flooding in Circle, Alaska. So this log home went through a flood. It's now been jacked up, and they're assessing the needs to protect this home into the future. So we're going to take a look now at each of the things that we're going to be looking at in this damage assessment. And one of the most important is photo documentation. As we know, a picture speaks 1,000 words. And what images are going to do for you in your damage assessment is actually give you what's really going on. So you can have 3 to 4 people go through your building. They're all taking notes. They're all looking at the same thing. And when you come back out, if you haven't taken photographs, everyone will have seen something different. So having the photographs just gives you an accurate representation of what's going on, because our memories aren't always the best, especially under the stress. This is going to be the first time we're going to see our building after the disaster. So there is going to be a lot of stress. There is going to be a lot of distraction. So the photographs are going to be important. And you're going to want to take photographs close up, but you also want to get that big picture. So in the image on the slide here, we see somebody from FEMA taking a picture from across the river that flooded to the building that was damaged during the flood. And so we want to see the big picture along with the smaller details. And, you know, what's so nice now about doing disaster response is that we all pretty much have cell phone cameras. Digital cameras are cheap and ubiquitous. When I first started out doing disaster response and recovery, we thought the neatest thing since sliced bread were the disposable cameras. You could put a bunch of them into your disaster kit. You didn't need to worry about taking them on site because they were just cheap disposable things that if you accidentally dropped them into water, it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like you took your expensive single lens reflex camera and dropped it into a puddle of sewage. So, that's where I'm coming from. And you had a limited number of photos you could take, so you had to be very selective. Now, with digital cameras, we can take anything and everything we want and have that image instantaneously pop up on the back of the camera, so we can also make sure that it's in focus. That was another problem with waiting for your film to be developed. Were our pictures in focus? And you can zoom in and out so easily with digital photos, which you also couldn't with your photographic prints. So we're really lucky to have that technology available to us. I want you to be aware, though, if you use your personal cell phone to take pictures at a disaster site and you work for like a state or municipal entity, you need to be aware that at some point, and this may not be the case in Alaska, but I know it was in Massachusetts, and it was a revelation to me to learn this. The state can requisition your phone to get the images if it wants. And so if it requisitions your phone, it doesn't necessarily, you know, isn't necessarily going to just look at the photographs you took. They have access to your entire phone. So this would be something really important to speak to the first responders about in Alaska and find out what the regulations in Alaska are. And this could be a great discussion for our upcoming meetings. Along with digital cameras and our cell phones being great innovations, we now have access to drones. And drones can give us a view of our building, our site after a disaster that standing on the ground and taking photographs can't give us. And they can really help to add information to the bigger picture of what's happened and what's going on. So, as always with drones, there are laws and regulations that you have to follow. So in terms of federal law, the only federal law that really applies in Alaska is that law enforcement can't invade your privacy using drones. So that's not a concern for us. But there are state laws that you need to think about, and there aren't many. So basically, again, it's limiting, placing limits on how law enforcement can use drones. But that law could be problematic if you're asking your local police department to be the drone operators and take pictures at your site. So you would need to work through some things with them. Otherwise, Alaska doesn't really have an umbrella state law, but you do need to follow a couple of local drone laws. One is in southeastern Alaska. During open commercial salmon fishing, you can't use drones because they think you're using drones to locate salmon, and that's just cheating. And then there are restrictions on drones in Chugach, I hope I pronounced that right, State Park. And you can't use drones there. So if your institution is located within the state park, something again you need to know. But what you also need to know is that sometimes if it's a federally declared disaster and the National Guard is on site, there may be special instance restrictions on using a drone. So it's going to be very important to speak to your first responders to find out just what you can and cannot do in terms of drone usage. Of course, this all assumes that the institution knows somebody who is who can operate the drone. There are commercial drone operators out there. That would be an extra expense. But one of the things I learned doing the program in Massachusetts is that one of the departments of the state fire department is a special drone unit. And so your state fire department, your state fire academy, your state police may have access to drones. And at least from what I understood in Massachusetts, they are more than happy to come and fly their drones around and take pictures of your disaster because they're still new to it. And every event that they can go to take drone footage is a learning opportunity for them. So again, build those relationships. It really helps to from all angles and in areas that you wouldn't even think that you would need to build relationships in. Find a drone operator, make friends. So of course, thinking about our strategic priorities, one of the most important things to be looking at in your damage assessment are the health and safety needs. So you've already taken the steps to make sure that you are safe doing the damage assessment. Everybody's wearing sturdy boots, you know, hard hats, goggles, masks, all the fun stuff because you need to do it to be safe. So now you're going to take the next step and go ask yourself, when everybody else comes in, what are the health and safety needs we are going to need to be considering? So we want to, of course, in conjunction with our facilities person, again, always making sure that the building is stable. So we know that the building is stable. Now we're going to be looking for little structural instabilities within the building that could be problematic. It could be a bulge in a plaster ceiling that structurally, isn't going to cause the building to fall down, but it could cause the plaster to rain down on workers when they're starting the recovery. And so we need to be looking for things like that. We, of course, are always making sure that the electrical system, gas, water, oil, name a utility. If you've got it, make sure it's turned off because you don't want any surprises. You want to make sure that you are looking for any possible slipping, tripping, or straining hazards. So, for instance, here on this slide, we see an image of the Eagle Custom House after the 2009 flood. And we see an awful lot of mud. So was that mud carried into the building? Is that mud going to be slippery? If we think back to the tsunami in Kodiak in 1964, there's probably seaweed galore. Seaweed is slippery. Are we going to have problems with that? Do we have a lot of debris that was carried in, rocks and tree limbs and dead fish, in our building as a result of the flooding? Are we going to be tripping over that? And always be thinking, because the vast majority of our disasters are going to involve water in one way, shape, or form, we need to always be thinking that the collections that we're used to handling every day are now, particularly if they're organic, much more heavy. So we need to make sure that we're thinking about how heavy materials are and how our workers can safely lift these items without injuring themselves. We're going to be always thinking during this damage assessment about wild animals. Disasters do not only impact us, they impact nature around us. And for anybody who, even in a non-disaster situation, has surprised a squirrel in their attic, knows that frightened animals react unpredictably. And so we want to make sure that when we're doing our damage assessment, as well as when we're training the people to go in and do the cleanup, that we are telling them nobody sticks a hand into a dark pocket. We're going to work from the outside in. We're not going to be going and just kicking things, and whatnot. We're going to be moving thoughtfully and carefully in the event that there are angry wild animals in our building, because they possibly would have taken shelter in there depending on the disaster. They may have been carried there beyond their will. They're not going to be happy. So really use caution. We're always going to be thinking about the chemical exposure. So this could be as innocuous as the cleaning chemicals kept in the bathroom, but it also could be from asbestos, carbon monoxide, arsenic if you've got lots of taxidermied heads. It could be formaldehyde or other alcohols if you have jarred specimens. It could be so many different things, including lead. So, if you still have lead piping, you could have lead in your building. Again, going back to Notre Dame, one of the biggest health and safety issues during the recovery at Notre Dame has been all of the lead from the lead roof that volatilized and came down as soot. So soot in particular is a really hazardous chemical because we don't know what's in there, but we do know what we have in our building. So if you have anything plastic, your soot could be hazardous to your health. So it's really, really important to be aware that all of these things could be lurking, and to wear your PPE, and then to wash your hands when you're done. And then, again, depending on the time of year, depending on the collections, mold could be an issue. And I know, for Alaska, it's going to be so dependent on what part of the state you're in. For some of you, mold is probably going to be just a blip on your radar and you're not going to worry about it. In other parts, there could be klaxons going off. Mold, mold, mold. So again, know your area, know your hazards, and this is why risk assessment was so important and why we really want you to do a risk assessment. Because water is going to be involved in so many of our disasters, I wanted to take a moment to talk about the fact that not all water is equal. We essentially have 3 different types of water, potentially 4. Potentially 4. So we have clean water. That's going to be the water that comes out if a pipe bursts or your sprinkler system discharges, or essentially coming out of fire hoses. Is it potable? Not necessarily, but it's not going to cause you any illness if it splashes onto your body. We then have gray water. This is water that contains chemical, biological, or physical contamination. The best way to think about gray water is the water that's draining out of your washing machine after you've done laundry, or the water that's going down your drain after you've done the dishes. So it could cause discomfort, but it's not likely to have a huge impact. Black water, on the other hand, is unsanitary and contains pathogenic agents. So this is going to be any of your floodwaters, because floodwaters aren't just water and mud and silt. They're also, and natural debris, but they're dead bodies. They are, sewage from, a sewage plant. They can contain, depending on what it is, it could be salt water. So whenever you're in a flood situation, so like we see in the image on this slide at the upper left, which is the flooding in Galena, Alaska in 2013, or when we come back to Kodiak in 1964 in the lower left here, We have all sorts of contaminants in the water because if we look at these images, we see that the water isn't just coming from the river. It's now overflowed the banks and picking up gasoline and oil and debris from the streets. And depending on where you are, that debris from the streets could also be discarded needles or, other medical waste that, again, is going to be very harmful to our health. And looking at the picture, particularly from Kodiak, we see these cars parked that have been picked up and just deposited here. So knowing all of the chemicals that are in our vehicles, we know that's in the mix. But then on top of it, particularly for those of you on the coast, you're going to have salt in that water too. And salt can be extremely corrosive for a lot of metals, which is going to just hasten their deterioration and could cause subsequent problems down the line. And in particular, if those pipes are lead, it could cause spalling from the lead pipes, which is just going to get lead into the mix and again, just cause a lot of problems. Another thing to think about, and this is going to be also based on your own risk assessment, and I'm just going to show my ignorance of Alaska, but there could be a lot of chemical residue from mining or industry that could also be problematic. So again, with that risk assessment, it's not only knowing your immediate area, but for those of you on rivers, who's upriver? And if something major happens, what is that river carrying down to us? So, that risk assessment is such an education to help with disaster response, as well as with your disaster planning. So we're also in this damage assessment with our team of 3 to 4, going to be looking at building needs. And again, our building needs are not necessarily obvious. So we need to be assessing things, and this is why you want your facilities person there, because we need to be assessing everything and looking at it from the really obvious to those problems that might be hidden. So thinking about, the obvious and the hidden, we come back to photo documentation as well. Take pictures, even if it seems obvious to you. It's like, oh, we're never going to forget about these big cracks in the ground leading up to our building. But it's not the fact that you're going to forget about the cracks leading up to the building, but where exactly in the building are they leading to? And that's what you might forget. So taking pictures of the blatantly obvious down to what's not, what could be hidden. So, using your camera to get into some of those hidden spots where there might be an angry squirrel or an angry raccoon or an angry badger, or, pick your angry animal, is going to be really helpful. But, again, we want to be taking lots of pictures of building needs. So here we see a building after the 2018 earthquake. And, from the ground level, we've got lots of cracks in the ground. We see cracks in the foundation or the retaining walls for the landscaping. We see the left side of the building tipping a little bit, and the entire entry stairs have been picked up and moved. And so that's, what we're seeing from the outside. So what is that translating to on the inside? And this is where taking note of all of that that's going on is going to help you know what you're going to need to do during your recovery. And here is another instance where a drone view might have been really helpful, because we don't know if there's any real structural damage to the roof, but you might know if you could get up from above. So again, having your facilities person on that assessment team is going to be really important, because they're going to know not just on the surface level, the visual level, what could be damaged, but they know where the plumbing goes. They know where the wiring goes. They know where the ductwork is. And so they're going to be able to have a much better sense of mechanically what's going on with the building as well as structurally. And then you're going to be looking at your collections needs. How much of your collection was affected? What kind of materials are involved? Because we all know that libraries aren't just books and archives aren't just paper. We all have a variety of materials. So what materials are involved? Is it paper? Is it photograph? Is it leather? Is it cloth? Is it wood? Is it metal? Is it ceramics? All of this is important for planning purposes. We want to be thinking about the value of the material. And we're not just thinking monetary value here. We're thinking research value as well as cultural value. So again, a lot of the collections that we hold are culturally significant for different communities across your own city and across the state. So again, having those relationships built, like I know that the state museum has in particular, having those relationships with communities across the state is going to be very important during your disaster response and recovery, because they can be a lot of help. They may not be boots on the ground help, but they will have that intellectual value help. And then always remembering that part of what we need to assess in terms of collections isn't just our accessioned collections, but it is those documents and that information that we need for the actual functioning of our institution. So personnel records, your deed of incorporation, your 501c3 status, any sort of tax exempt paper, anything like that is going to be so important, because your staff wants to still get paid because they're working and they still want to get paid. But also all of that documentation about who you are and how you are structured as a business is going to be necessary for any sort of aid that you would go for after a disaster. So if it's a larger regional federally declared disaster, FEMA is going to need that information. A state declared disaster, the state's going to need that information. Any of the granting agencies are going to need that information. So you want to be sure that that is also something you're salvaging if the only copy you have is on paper. But it also means that you need to be aware of what sort of backup you have for any digital collections. So if you have, digital backups of your important function, institutional documentation, but you have it on your computer and the only backup you have is on a CD that sits on the shelf above the computer, if you've had a fire, then your backup is useless. So don't ever forget your digital assets throughout your planning process. They are just as important to keep in mind as all of your other collections. And the beauty is that you can back them up somewhere safe so that in the event of a disaster, you don't need to worry about them. So what you want to be thinking about, again, because this is a quick assessment, is not handling anything right away. So unlike in this image here that we see of one of the staff members of the Alaska State Archives, we're not going to be picking up boxes, dumping the water off of them, and assessing the actual contents of the box during that initial damage assessment. What we would do is we would take photographs and, in our notes for the damage assessment, say the temporary covering to the roof during repairs blew off in a major rainstorm. The archives was inundated with water, and now we have X number of archival boxes that are wet. We have X number that are damp. things of that nature. So again, during the damage assessment is not when we're going to be picking things up and looking at them, because that could damage the collections. There could be hidden critters that we don't know about. And are we sure that shelving is structurally sound? Because wet sodden archives are considerably heavier than they are when they are dry. So, structurally, can that shelving hold the load? And until we know, we don't want to be moving anything around. So then once we have gathered all of that information, and it's a lot of information, we want to go on to plan. And one of my favorite quotes is from Dwight D. Eisenhower. Plans are nothing. Planning is everything. So as we know, if you come into a job and you have a disaster plan and you weren't part of the planning, how valuable is that plan? It's just a piece of paper that you probably will never read and will only look at in the event of a disaster. But then if that's the first time you've looked at it, how helpful is that plan? But the planning process, everything that you are doing in this program is vital. You are learning so much about your institution and about your collections that you never knew before. So the process is what is so critical. And just as with writing your disaster plan, when we go to write our incident action plan, it's that action of planning that is so important for a successful disaster response and recovery. So again, now that we've gathered all of the information, we need to assess that information, classify it, what's critical, what's important, what's something we'd like to do, and what can wait for a while, and then prioritize it. So within each classification, we need to prioritize, because as we all know, if you just write yourself a list of things that you need to do, but you don't prioritize it, you're going to go for that low-hanging fruit, get those easy things done first, while the most glaring important thing to do, say shut the water off of the overflowing toilet, gets left behind and more damage can occur. So it's really important to classify and prioritize. And this way, everyone involved in the command structure of your incident command team knows what is important, what needs to get done first, what needs to get done second, and so on, so that they know how to deploy their teams to get the actual work done. So here we see, excuse me, a picture of the staff at the University of Alaska Southeast in Ketchikan. I'm sorry if it's Southwest. Doing some salvage work after a pipe burst. So do we know if they assessed everything, classified, planned? At this stage, from just looking at the image, we don't know for sure, but I suspect they've got a series of boxes, they've got a series of big garbage bags. My guess is that they did do an assessment and that they do know what books are most important to salvage, which ones they can replace, and how to sort them due to wetness so that they can get them dried and taken care of. So, that's a simple, you've had a pipe burst, you've got books that are wet, you've got books that are damp, you have books that are dry. So we've assessed it, pipes burst, things are wet, we've got about this much that's wet. We're classifying it into dry, damp, and wet. And then we're going to prioritize. What are our priority collections? What would be difficult to replace? What is unique to us? What is easy to replace? So, okay, it's a university library. They probably don't have an adult romance section, but if you're a public library, Danielle Steele can easily be replaced. Reference books tend to be much more costly and difficult to get in some instances. Those would be a priority over adult romance. So then you start to prioritize within the wet, what's most important to get dry, within the damp, what's most important, and within the dry, they can just get packed up and go somewhere else. So, you're assessing, classifying, and prioritizing. That was a simple example. It gets much more complex. And so then, once we have assessed, classified, and prioritized, we go on to write our incident action plan. And this is going to really be set up as to exactly where you're going to coordinate your response from, because you do need a home base that has electricity, that has heat, that has running water, so you can go to the bathroom, and preferably has an internet connection, telephone service, all of that, because there's going to be so much work that you need to do. You need all of these services. Sometimes that's not easy to get, particularly if it's been a region-wide disaster. So you need to learn to be flexible and to make deliberate decisions throughout your disaster response and recovery. And so part of that incident action plan is going to be what PPE you need and what sort of equipment you need to make the work site safe, what outside consultants or vendors you're going to need to bring in. But it's also going to break it down to a much more granular level as well. So you've classified that you've got wet books, damp books, and dry books. So you need boxes to pack away books. And if you're at a larger institution and you've got multiple departments within, say, the library here doing this work, you've got the reference collection doing their own classification between wet, damp, and dry. You've got your special collections doing it. You've got your, general collections doing it. You bring all three of those departments together to say, okay, each of you, how many boxes do you need, so that you have one box order to put in rather than three. And you've got all these departments needing tables set up so that they can air dry their books. So on top of how many tables do each of you need, so you can get the appropriate number of tables, you'll be getting the appropriate amount of blotting paper for those books to sit on, to get absorbed. You'll need the paper towels to help absorb the really wet materials to get as much water out before you go to stand them up and air dry. So instead of letting each department make their own plan and make their own orders, the incident commander brings all of those departments together, gets their reports, and then the command team puts in one single order, which saves, because you can get volume discounts, you can get discounts on shipping. So by, creating these plans, you consolidate information, which speeds up ordering, which makes ordering less expensive, and can really coordinate between teams if expensive equipment is needed to reduce the cost of your overall response and recovery. And that's a big thing. So planning is everything. So I just want to say that for the damage assessment and writing your incident action plan, there's a lot to think about, but you don't need to make it up on your own. So one of the materials in your resources is Implementing the Incident Command System at the Institutional Level by David Carmichael. Excellent book, full of forms for you to use. So it's got forms for doing the damage assessment. It's got forms for helping you create your incident command structure. It's got forms to help you assess and classify the information you've gathered in your damage assessment, and then it's got forms to help you write your incident action plan. Everything is there to help. So if you haven't gotten it already, get that book. It's going to be extremely helpful in the future. One of your other references is the Field Guide to Emergency Response that you can get from the American Institute for Conservation. They actually have forms that are really specific for helping you gather information on collections. So if your facilities person has forms from David Carmichael's book, the collections person is going to have the forms from the field guide, because they give you the specific information to help you remember that what you are doing during the damage assessment isn't looking at each individual item. It's looking at your collections as a whole. So rather than saying, standing there during your damage assessment and counting all of the books that are wet, you would say X ranges of shelving have gotten wet. And because what there are averages that can be easily found as to how many books are on a shelf, how many shelves are in each section, and how many sections are in each range, you can calculate that. But, for your damage assessment, you just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 ranges of shelving are wet from a burst pipe, or X linear feet of archival collections, or again, X ranges of shelving of museum collections. And you would have a much better idea of what that entails, knowing where the damage occurred, and what type of damage it is, as to what volume of collections you could be looking at. We're not looking for the details during the damage assessment. We're looking for that big picture. And then, of course, those photographs help. And then you can get into the details as you are continuously assessing, classifying, and prioritizing during the recovery and the continual rewriting of the incident action plan. So one of the members of your team is hopefully somebody who is just taking photographs, and that person would hopefully be your information officer. And I want to take a moment to not only help you understand the importance of that information officer during disaster response, but also just in general, how critical communication is during a disaster. You have to have good communication between staff in that immediate response. So the fire alarms are going off. The staff needs to communicate that everyone is out of the building. You need to have a gathering point. You need to have some way to, do a head count. You need to communicate with each other during that immediate response to ensure everyone is safe. And then you need to make sure that you're communicating with people who may not be there that day about what's going on. Okay, so you're constantly communicating in that immediately response within your own staff, but then also with outside entities that you would need. You're calling 911, you're calling the ambulance, you're calling the plumber, you're calling the glazier and the carpenter because a moose got mad at his reflection in your window and charged your window. These things happen. At least they happen here in New England. So I'm sure you've got, moose in the rutting season who get a little bit upset that another, bull is in their territory and it turns out to be themselves. So, you've got that immediate response communication, but then you move into your full disaster response and recovery, where the communication shifts. And now, as we get into that transitional response, we're doing the damage assessment, we're doing all of the planning, preparing for recovery. We start to build out our ICS command structure. And so now all of a sudden, our communication is shifting. We're not all talking to each other, in every direction. We're structuring now our communication so that everything flows up to who you report to, and then eventually up to the incident commander, and then flows down from the incident commander through that command structure and down into the individual workers. So we're really thinking about changing how we communicate during response and recovery to ensure that it's all flowing in a logical manner so that nothing is falling through the cracks. Because as we learned in ICS, each individual person only reports to one person. So that if you have something that you need, if you've found a new problem and you need to report it, you report it to your immediate supervisor in the incident command system. So the person immediately over you, and then that person moves it up the chain of command to the incident commander so that nothing is lost. We also want to be thinking about communicating with the outside world because, for a lot of us, we are very beloved in our community. And so they're going to want to know what has happened. And this is where your information officer shines. They are the only person to speak to the media because they are the only person who has all of the information, because they are getting that information directly from the incident commander, and the information officer is the only one who will be speaking with the outside world. Now that can come during your immediate response. So whoever is, previously dedicated as your information officer, that person and that person alone is going to go up to the first firefighter they see, and they're going to say, who is your information officer? And that your institutional information officer will then speak with the information officer from the fire department. They are the only two people that are going to communicate between the two entities, between cultural heritage and the fire department. The only two people who will be speaking across those two entities are the information officers. Then your information officer takes on the role of being the person to speak to the media. So if you've got your entire staff on site doing disaster recovery and the media is there, and the media comes up to you, Joe Schmo, who is schlepping boxes to the freezer truck that you've rented to get the collections frozen so they can be stabilized, and that person from the newspaper asks you a question, you tell them, I don't have that information. You need to go speak to our information officer. And that's the way it is, because you need to control your message because it can get ugly really fast. And we have seen just how ugly things can get when communication isn't controlled. So we really need to make sure the only person speaking to the media is that information officer. They have the information. That's their job. It is not yours. So what do we want to be thinking about in terms of communicating with the outside world? We want to make sure in our planning process that we are planning for communication as well. And so it's really handy, and I've done this in institutions that I've worked for before, to write a disaster statement that kind of works like Mad Libs or writing your obituary ahead of time. This event happened on this date, and, fill in the blank for specifics. But then you also, want to be sure that you have a little flexibility for tweaking it, so, but you want to make sure the salient points are in there. So this happened on this day. These are the collections that got damaged. These are how the collections got damaged. And our most important collection that everybody really wants to know about is okay, or is decimated, or is salvageable, or we don't know at this time, we're still gathering information. That's a great phrase to have in any information officer's pocket. So why we write some of these ahead of time is then you're prepared in the event of a disaster and you don't have to think about what to write in the heat of the moment. But also, depending on the institution that you work for, if you are a subsidiary of a larger institution, so you are a museum that's part of a university, or you're a state entity, a lot of times any sort of statements that go to the media need to be passed through a legal counsel. And if you can get your boilerplate signed off, you don't have to go through the lengthy process of getting everything approved by legal before you can give a statement. So if legal says yes, all you need to do is fill in the blanks and you're good to go, then in the event of a disaster, you're good to go. But we do want to be communicating with our communities, with our general public, with our users. And so we want to have these statements ready. So in the last slide, we were looking at the image of the librarians at the University of Alaska Southeast, or maybe it's Southwest. Oh, there it is. Southeast. Sorry. And so they had a bit that went out, and we see that the Ketchikan librarians freeze thousands of books after pipe bursts. Plain and simple, title. We have information on what happened, when it happened, and what they're doing and what was affected. And so we can see here on the slide that some books may be beyond repair. That was a statement, in the article. Bowling says they're not sure just how many. The UAS Ketchikan campus library has an academic library for its classes and research. So that's kind of giving you background on what sort of materials they have. And then, they say we have such a unique collection. We're going to do our best to salvage what we can and replace what we can, and try not to cry too much during that. Again, it's okay to take time to cry. This has been a library that's been built over decades. And so we're given some of that background. And then most importantly, we get the tidbit that one of the hardest hit areas is the Alaska Native Culture and Language Collection. But Bowling said, fortunately, none of the rarest books were damaged. So yes, some of our most important collections got hit, but the rarest among those are fine. And so you can see we're just, working here, giving enough information for people to understand what happened, but also information that people know that this is an ongoing process, but that the goal is, to be able to salvage as much as possible. So it's really good to be thinking about some of these statements ahead of time, and especially to be thinking about comments that you may want to make. Because if you bring the media in too early and everybody is still flustered, heaven only knows what you're going to say that you're going to have to backtrack on in the future. So, just be really, really careful, as we all know, about what you say to the media. We've learned so much about that in the last few years. So, just so you know, you don't have to do this alone. Disaster response and recovery is not something where everybody is going to, shun you. There are people that want to help. So there are the National Heritage Responders, which are a group of conservators, curators, and other allied professionals who are part of the American Institute for Conservation. And I am a member of that. And we are a group that offers assistance over the phone, as well as on-site salvage assistance when it's a region-wide disaster. So heaven forbid there is another earthquake and tsunami. If there was, though, you could call in the National Heritage Responders, and we'd send a team of conservators to help. And what we would do is the conservators that would go to help would be those who have areas of specialty that really tie in with your collections. There's the Alliance for Response. This is another group supported by the Foundation for the American Institute for Conservation. And it is a regional or sometimes citywide group of cultural heritage and first responders who help to educate and respond to disasters. I am not sure if there are any Alliance for Response groups in Alaska, but this program could be a really good opportunity to think about starting one, at least starting one in Fairbanks, starting one in Anchorage, and starting one in Juneau, so that there are some regional sort of alliance for responses across Alaska. And again, I work with a lot of the same people in AFR. I'm on an Alliance for Response group for Albany. So again, it's something near and dear to my heart. You can also get volunteers through the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. These are generally going to be more trained volunteers and are really good people for coming in and helping shift debris or clean up a space after a disaster. They may not be collection specialists that the National Heritage Responders are, but they are bodies if you need them. And then never forget that support isn't just help with the work. Sometimes the support is to support the workers. And so the American Red Cross can be incredibly important and helpful in disaster situations. So I want to say a little bit now about volunteers. Volunteers can be wonderful, but they can also be a headache. So if you plan to use volunteers in your planning process before you ever have a disaster, know what you're going to want the volunteers to do, and then have somebody on your team designated as the volunteer officer. So you can create your own ICS position called the volunteer officer. And that person is in charge of the volunteers. They will be assigning duties to the volunteers. They will be supervising the volunteers, and they will be making sure that at all times, volunteers can do a lot of very helpful work, but one of the areas where they can really shine is in supporting the staff members who are actually doing the work. So they can be making the coffee and bringing in the donuts and having the hot apple cider or the hot cocoa on hand to keep people fed and hydrated. And then they can be in charge of, a tent specifically for relaxation. It's a quiet spot to get away from everything, because you do get overwhelmed during a disaster response and recovery. And sometimes you just need to go somewhere quiet and dark and still to just decompress and relax. Not eat, not drink, just be, and then go back to it. And these are the places that volunteers can really help manage, so that the heavy work that could result in liabilities for volunteers who aren't trained can be done. And I'm going to put in a final comment that one of your biggest areas of support are going to be your colleagues. So all of you are going through cohorts, and your cohort is a naturally built support network. So you now know that you have colleagues across the state of Alaska that have the same training as you do. So that if your region gets hit, so you are in Anchorage and Anchorage gets hit and you've got a region-wide disaster, you know that you can call on your colleagues from the Fairbanks area or the Juneau area or from across the entire state
to have trained volunteers who are, could very possibly help. And so part of this entire program is helping build that support network across the state, particularly in a state where travel isn't easy. And so it, would take time for the National Heritage Responders to get to you, for the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster to get to you. But your local state colleagues know how to travel, and they could get to you much more quickly to be of assistance. So don't forget that you are building your own little network and community here of trained disaster people. And speaking of training, you're going through the PACO program. This is not the end of your training. You've got your disaster plan. You need to train in how to use that. So we've been talking about, training in your disaster plan and doing building walkthroughs so everybody understands where the fire poles are, where the shutoff valves are. You're going through that sort of training specific to your building. But then you need to do training to ensure that you actually know how to respond to a disaster and use your disaster plan. So one of the things that I like to recommend is that your core disaster response team that you're setting up as part of your planning gets together once a month, and you sit down and you have lunch together and you do a little tabletop scenario. And in that tabletop scenario, it can be something as simple as, in the beginning, the fire alarms are going off. What do we do? Or the toilet is overflowing. What do we do? And then you start to make them progressively more complex. So now your toilet is overflowing, but your plumber is on vacation in Tahiti. What do you do? Or, um, you know, the river has flooded, and the person you have designated as incident commander cannot get to the site because of the flooding of the river. What do you do? So you can, start with some simple scenarios that are very straightforward and direct. And then as you get more comfortable in using your plan for the simple things, start to throw in wrenches and problems so that you've got these issues covered in your disaster plan. Do you have somebody listed as a backup incident commander in the event that your incident commander cannot be there? Do you have backups for other roles? And do you have multiple backups for some roles? Just in the event that your incident commander and your operations specialist are married and they're both on vacation in Tahiti. What do you do? So, training is going to be absolutely critical. And sometimes you can get really creative in your disasters in training, just so that you can start to think in new and different ways from the tsunami, from the earthquake, from, the flooding. So the image that you see here in this slide is one of my favorite disasters. I tend to collect disasters. And it is the Great Molasses Flood of January 15th, 1919. This is in the north end of Boston. And it was a very, very much an immigrant community, very much Italian immigrants like it is today. And it's right on the water. And so at this time, we're in the midst of World War I, and we needed a lot of alcohol for munitions. And so there was a multi-million gallon holding container for molasses that would come up from the Caribbean. And the molasses was then used to make the alcohol for the war. And they had just filled the tank with molasses, so it was full to the brim. And then Boston experienced a warm spell in January. And um, it's a great example on many different levels, but I won't digress, we'll stick to the disaster. And molasses does what molasses does when it starts to warm up, and it started to ferment, and it blew the tank open, and there was a tidal wave of molasses that just ran into the area and then hit the hill and started coming back. And so you have this essentially tsunami, but it's not a tsunami of water. It's a tsunami of molasses. What do you do? So you can take some of these concepts, and apply them to your situations in Alaska. So do you have an oil refinery? And for some reason, one of those big oil tanks burst, and you don't have an oil tanker on the ocean like the Exxon Valdez. Now you've just got this river or tsunami of oil, crude oil, all over everything. What do you do? So sometimes it helps to get a little creative in your disasters just to keep everybody engaged. But it's amazing when you get creative, what issues come up that nobody would have really thought about. So never, ever, ever stop training. So one of the things that you can be thinking about in your training is how you're going to go about doing some of the salvage operations that you might need to do. So as you again progress in your own in-house training, you can say, okay, we've had a pipe burst and the water didn't actually come into contact with our collections, but it soaked into the carpeting that was on the floor and increased the relative humidity in our building to extremely high levels. What do we do? And, dehumidification is one of the things that you can do. So, are you going to do dehumidification yourself, or are you going to bring in a vendor to do it? If you do the dehumidification yourself, do you know the size of the and number of dehumidifiers you're going to need to lower the relative humidity sufficiently? Do you know how those dehumidifiers are going to interact with your own HVAC system? And do you have a plan for how you're going to empty all of the tanks in those dehumidifiers? You could take the salvage option. Another good salvage option for in-house work is air drying. So as we were talking about with the library in Ketchikan, how much space are you going to need to set up those books? What blotter are you going to need for those books? Do you have a space that's actually dry to set them up in? So going through some of these salvage options in your training is a great way to make sure you have the thought process down for how you're going to gather everything you need. And if you have the space, you can freeze things. If it's a small disaster, you can freeze things in house for stabilization, and a home chest freezer works great. But what if you need more space in the freezer? What can you do? Are there fishing companies that you could potentially use their freezers for? Are there schools near you that, if it's not during school time, can they fire up their freezers for you so you could use them? Do you know where you can hire a reefer truck that you can bring in and put on site? And do you know what you would need to do to keep that reefer truck operational so you can pack your boxes of wet materials in there to freeze? Have you made those relationships with the vendors to come in and do vacuum freeze drying? Have you made those relationships with the conservators that you might need? You can incorporate all of this into your training. And then, you know, what materials can you discard? There are many institutions that have instituted the process called deaccession by disaster. You know, we've all got things in our collections that we really wish we didn't. And sometimes the silver lining in a disaster, it means that we can now deaccession those items because they have been damaged, and thus we have the foundation to say we can discard or deaccession this item. So these 6 types of ways of going about doing salvage, we're going to go into much more when we actually meet for the in-person workshops. But I wanted to get you thinking about some of these options so that you can start to incorporate them potentially into your disaster plans, but also incorporate them into any training that you do in terms of your disaster plan and disaster response. So I want to now reiterate CJ's 5 golden rules of emergency response because they really are important and they're a great way to summarize what we have been talking about in our webinar today. So we have our strategic priorities. So personal safety is number 1. Always number 1 is your personal safety. 1.5 is the safety of others. 2 is property stabilization, and 3 is the salvage of collections, and it will always be in that order. You will never start to salvage collections if you can't guarantee your personal safety. It will always go 1, 1.5, 2, and then 3. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Can't say it enough. Talk to each other, but then also follow the incident command structure for the flow of information. Make sure you've got your obituary written ahead of time, and make sure that, you know, everything is done correctly. And then document, document, document. Make notes, take pictures, take lots of pictures, because they are not going to just be handy for your planning purposes, but they're going to be for insurance purposes. They're going to be for PR. They're going to be for ways that you can show your community, look how far we've come in our disaster recovery. Report to your responsible party. Going back to communication, information flows up to the incident commander and will only flow in one pipeline. You are not going to have multiple T branches coming off of that pipeline. Report to your immediate responsible party. And then train, 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 practice, practice, practice. Okay, it is so important, because the more we train, the more we practice, the more natural the reactions come. So it's, you know, if you think back now, some of us, you know, some things are so natural. I watch people knit, and they can knit and they aren't thinking about anything. They can knit and watch TV. They can knit and have a chat. They can be knitting. They can, you know, stop knitting for a second, take a drink of beer, put the beer down, go right back to knitting. One of our neighbors could just sit and chat to everybody. She'd sit on her front lawn, chat to everybody that walked by. She always had a beer when she was doing it, and she would just sit and knit, and she never dropped a stitch. Well, she didn't get to that point without practice. So she learned to knit where she had to think about every stitch and every movement her fingers were doing. You know, by the time she was 60, it was so ingrained in the muscle memory, she didn't need to think. So we want to take that analogy and put it into our disaster response, because the more we can practice, the more it becomes second nature. The easier those immediate responses are going to become, because we're going to know who to call. We may have to look up their phone number, but we know whose number to look for now. And it just becomes so much easier. So keep these 5 golden rules in mind because they are going to make your life much easier. And when your life is easier, you get a much more efficient response and recovery, which means a less expensive response and recovery, and therefore a much more successful one. So, finally, we've covered a lot of ground today. I've thrown a lot of information at you. So be sure to check in with your mentor if you have any questions. We will be having a couple of office hours coming up, so be sure that you join in for those to ask any questions that you might have, or please feel free to email me at any time. I am happy to help, whether it's while you're, in cohort A, throughout the entirety of the PACO program, or if something comes up to you after we're done in the next 4 or 5 years, please feel free to email me. If I'm still alive, I will answer. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to meeting all of you in person when we have our meetings in Juneau, Anchorage, and Fairbanks. Thanks for joining me today.